All right. Well, I think we are going to call this a quorum, and we're going to press forward. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is the AMSSM National Fellows Online Lecture Series. And today we have the privilege of having two excellent speakers with us today. And I'll be introducing them in just a minute, but we'll be talking about travel and sleep disorders in athletes. Very important and timely topic. So before I dive into that, we are going to be hearing next week. For our annual meeting will be happening, so lots going on there. The following week, we have another installment of the online lecture series. Dr. Gary Green will be talking about performance-enhancing drugs on April 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern. So I encourage you to dial in and join us for that. Just to give the little bit of ground rules and background, this lecture series is intended to serve as an adjunct to your individual program's education and not to replace it. This is intended to give you access to national level subject matter experts and who can give you, the top notch, cutting edge information about these important topics. And this will assist you in the end in preparing for your CAQ and beyond that to taking care of our athletes in the best way possible. Okay, so we just remind everyone to keep your microphone muted, turn off your video. You can submit questions through the chat function and include your name and program if you wish. I will be answering and moderating those, or asking and moderating those questions at the end of the program. There will also be an evaluation, which we would appreciate if you could fill out and submit. That was always helpful. We do value your voice and your input. Okay, without further ado, our speakers. First off, we'll be hearing from Dr. Chris Bach. Chris is a PhD CSCS at the University of Nebraska, where he directs the Athletic Performance Lab, oversees the entire sports science arm of the Nebraska athletics program. He is, involved in many things, including some task forces with the NFL and exercise science research in multiple different areas. He's published on multiple topics, including sleep and various aspects of human performance. He is, so he works daily with coaching performance and athletic medicine staffs on the implementation of GPS, heart rate monitors, other wearable sensor technology, helping monitor training loads and optimizing training and recovery, reducing risk of injuries. Truly an expert in this field, and he's highly regarded amongst his colleagues, and we're very fortunate to have him. He'll be talking to us for 20 minutes about the performance aspects of sleep and travel in athletes. He will be followed by Dr. Drew Watson, who is at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Watson is an assistant professor, Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation. He's actually a pediatrician and is board certified in pediatrics and sports medicine. He is a team physician at University of Wisconsin, and as well as a number of other teams as well. He is highly involved with the American Medical Society of Sports Medicine. He's also, I think this is really neat. I didn't know this, but he is the chair of the Youth Sports Advocacy Team, which is a group of pediatric sports medicine specialists who work to develop tools for families, coaches, and healthcare providers to improve the health and safety and well-being of young athletes, which I think is tremendous. I think that's admirable. And Drew, that's awesome that you're doing that. We're very fortunate. Dr. Watson has published a multitude of topics as well. He's published multiple times on sleep disorders and injury risk, particularly in the pediatric population. So we look forward to hearing his thoughts on that. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Chris. And Chris, after you're done, we'll transition directly into Drew's talk. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you. Drew, I might be more interested in hearing your talk than anybody else. All right, so pull this up. what do you see here, I guess? Is this the note slide, or do you see the full presentation right now?
Yes, yeah, we can
Yes.
see the full presentation. You're good.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. My hope is that this presentation can shine a little bit of light on what sleep and travel looks like kind of in the trenches of sport. I'm in a little bit of a unique scenario, and it's probably quite different than many of you in the fact that I'm fully embedded with teams on a daily basis, working with them, like Nate said, on a variety of topics, really just trying to be the boots on the ground that bridges the gap between research and practice. Full disclosure, no conflicts of interest for this presentation. This is the sports science lab that I oversee. We do a whole variety of different things just to give you a concept of what we do here. Really, our goal is to kind of leave no stone unturned when it comes to athletic performance. So we do things like performance testing, biomechanics analysis, or biomechanical analysis, body composition testing. We have a bioscience lab here where we can take a look at biomarkers and how the bodies are responding to different stresses, either physical or psychological, different things like GPS and load monitoring. So there's a whole bunch of different things that we do here, but one of the things that I work very closely with our teams on is sleep education. In spite of me having whatever qualifications that I might have, our players and our coaches certainly want to take after the best. And fortunately, the kind of the approach with sleep and elite athletes has shifted a little bit. We are in a world that that really focuses on the quote unquote grind, and people take a lot of pride in that. But you have a lot of elite athletes now focusing and really getting the message across about the importance of sleep, particularly with athletes. And so we're starting to understand it a little bit better, but still there's quite a bit we don't know about sleep. A lot of that is because in athletes, it's really difficult to be embedded. It's really difficult to study them with some level of ecological validity. And not be super invasive into their environment. So the bottom line here is we all know that sleep is important, but we also know that there's a problem with it, not just with not just with athletes, but in general with the general population. In the last 75 years, in fact, it's just gotten worse and worse, and the amount of sleep an average adult gets per night has dropped by 21%, over 21%. So we know there's a problem, and I want to kind of show you this video. Hopefully it plays okay for everybody. This is from the movie Moneyball, and I think it really provides a good insight into what my daily conversations are like, but also kind of gives a good perspective on kind of where we are in the sleep field. All right. Essentially, the idea here is they say, we have to replace Jason Giambi, and that's the problem. He says, what's the problem? I said, we have to replace him. We have to replace his bats. He said, no, that's not the problem. The thing is that there are a bunch of rich teams, and then there are poor teams, and then there's us. And the whole point of this is we have to start to think differently. And I think with the field of sleep in particular, particularly in athletics, we have to have a willingness to rethink the way in which we're delivering services and support to our athletes. And likewise, how our performance teams are constructed to provide this in a comprehensive, kind of interdisciplinary manner. Like I said, we all acknowledge that there's a problem, but it's continuing to get worse. So whatever approaches we're taking aren't working. So I think that that's something that we have to continue to look at. Right now, in my experiences in different professional leagues and all through college, most sport organizations don't take into consideration the negative impacts that sleep and travel have on sports performance and on the body. They just kind of say, well, there's nothing we can do to prevent jet lag. The athletes aren't going to sleep. It's just something everyone has to deal with. But that's not true at all. Certainly we can't do things like change time zones, but if we attack it properly and we approach it in a very personal manner, not only can we minimize some of those negative effects, but we can also give ourselves a performance advantage over some of our competition, which certainly our coaches love. I know many of you know what sleep is, but kind of want to go over some of this because it really plays into how we educate our athletes. Two main stages of sleep here. Approximately every 90 minutes through the sleep, our brain oscillates between two different sleep stages, that being REM sleep or rapid eye movement and non-REM sleep. REM sleep is about 20 to 25% of the night. Non-REM sleep is the other 75 to 80%. The REM sleep is what a lot of people focus on. They both have very critical roles, but the restorative sleep that a lot of people focus on in the sporting context is the REM, the restorative sleep. With the non-REM sleep, it's the lighter sleep, but again, it has a really critical factor as well. With that, there are two governing forces that regulate our sleep. Those two governing forces are the circadian rhythm, which we all know. We have this kind of biological clock already built into our system. And then the other one is the sleep pressure signal of adenosine. I think Matthew Walker does a great job in his book, Why We Sleep, just explaining a lot of this stuff in layman's terms and really hammering home on the importance of sleep. But with this, we have the wake drive. So in the mornings, we really want to be awake. And then there's this buildup of the chemical adenosine in the body throughout the day. And that will continue to increase and continue to increase to the point where we go to sleep. And then our body acts as sort of this flushing system. And it dumps all the adenosine out of the body, or most of it. And we kind of reset as our bodies and the circadian rhythm is coming back up. And so that process continues on night in, night out. And the difference between the curved lines that you see here is a direct reflection of your desire to sleep. And we'll talk about how this is impactful for naps and different things. So in the morning here, there's a strong urge to be awake because the difference between those lines is very short. But as we get towards sleep, the adenosine has built up in the body. Our sleep drive is very high. Our circadian rhythms are at one of the lowest points. So we have a strong urge to sleep. So this is something that we continue to educate our athletes on, but we also talk to them about how not all sleep is equal. And so what you'll see here is early in the night, sleep is predominantly, our bodies predominantly focus on non-REM sleep. And as we progress throughout the night in these 90-minute cycles, we start to see that there's much more of a reliance on REM sleep. And so when we talk to our athletes all the time, and you hear the traditional, you need to get 8 hours of sleep a night, or 8 to 10. When we ask our athletes, okay, let's say you go to bed at 11 p.m. and you wake up at 7. If you were to go to bed at 11 tonight and wake up at 5, how much sleep have you lost? The logical approach here, the logical answer is 25%. I lost 2 of the 8 hours. And while that's technically true, it's a little bit misleading because late in the night, we start to really focus on that REM sleep. Our bodies really hammer home on that REM sleep. So even though we've only lost 25% of the total sleep time, we've actually lost out on about 60 to 90% of our REM sleep, which again, we talked about how important that is in the restorative focus. And it works both ways, right? If you wake up at the same time, but you go to bed 2 hours later, you're gonna lose predominantly a lot of that non-REM sleep, both of which again serve critical, though different kind of brain and body functions that play have a hand in a myriad of physical and mental health. So when it comes to sleep, we have athletes that are kind of burning the candles at both ends that we really need to address and focus on. When it comes to the performance concerns, how important is it really? Bottom line here is it's very important. All the different physical components, not even including a lot of the mental components that it plays into, but the physical components that we think of when we think of strong sport performance, the vertical jump power abilities, the strength, the speed, time to exhaustion, endurance, those types of things, all of that in the research is pretty clear that sleep and sleep deprivation has a pretty significant effect on that. And it has a big effect on that through some of these things that you see here on the slide. With muscle recovery, there's decreased rate of recovery, there's decreased reaction times, and the ability to consolidate information and hone in on the motor learning aspects, increased risk for illness and injury, as Dr. Watson will talk about here in a little bit, and certainly the ability to muscle glycogen resynthesis and to fill up our gas tanks. This also plays out when we talk about statistics on the court. This is the stuff that really gets our coaches' mindset. So this was a study done in Stanford by one of the leaders in sports sleep, Sherry Ma. She worked with the Stanford team, and they did a 5-week intervention where they said, we want you to sleep as much as you can for 5 straight weeks. The team went on average from 6.5 hours tonight to 8.5 hours with no other changes. And they saw 9% increases in free throw and 3-point percentage, sprint times improved, their fatigue levels went down. And this is kind of one of the ones that really hit home in the sporting world of this is not only affecting things that we can't see, but it's affecting the stat sheet, which really got the attention of our coaches. So while we're kind of going through all that, I think a huge component here is we need to understand what problems we need to address. The average American adult gets 6 hours and 31 minutes of sleep per night during the week, which is obviously an hour and a half below what most recommendations are. And so with this, we have so many people who feel like they're the exception to the rule. Matthew Walker has a great statement. He says that the number of individuals who can survive on 6 hours of sleep or less without showing any impairment, rounded to a whole number and expressed as a percent of the population, is 0. The reality is there's a small fraction of less than 1% of population that has the special gene that allows them to survive without some of these performance decrements on about 5 hours of sleep. Now, the thing that we're dealing with, and we'll talk about this here in a little bit, is we're dealing with very high performing individuals. And a lot of the folks on this call are the exact same. And a lot of the ways that people think about it is, I must be that exception to the rule. And the reality is that we're not, right? When you are sleep deprived, you don't know you are sleep deprived. It's kind of like if I go to the bar tonight and I have 4 or 5 drinks, by the time I get done, subjectively, I feel fine and I feel like I can drive home. Objectively, though, is obviously certainly a different matter. And so we need to keep those types of things in mind. When it comes to collegiate athletes in particular, the NCAA did a goals survey and it found out less than 25%, less than a quarter of our collegiate athletes reported actually getting the 8 hours of sleep per night. Now this 8 to 10, which everybody suggests, is suggested to be much higher for athletes because of the increased burden of training loads and decreased sleep and academic requirements. And so you can see here in some of these charts, there's some real concerns with sleep, and the majority of athletes are just frankly not getting it. Poor sleep quality is also prevalent. We saw over 70% of male and over 80% of female collegiate athletes reported a preference for more sleep. So we're seeing this scenario in collegiate athletes where they want more and they need more, but the quality of it is also poor. And like I said, we're dealing with a specific population that's exceptionally good at pushing themselves extremely hard. They don't know when to stop. They're prone to mental health issues. And again, they're exceptionally good at self-deceiving. And they have to be, right? So that they can convince themselves that they can beat the team that they're playing that day and whatever else. So that's our baseline. We have to meet them where they are. And that's the problem that we need to address. So how are we going to think about this differently to work with these factors and to work with the populations that we're dealing with? Again, here just some more data here to talk about the prevalence of poor sleep, the daytime tiredness that we're seeing in collegiate athletes. And I show you this and I talk to you about kind of the high-performing individuals because it's no different than surgeons. I've consulted with a surgical team, local surgical team, the nursing staff, everybody involved. We actually monitored their sleep. And we're taking a look at, we used a band called Ready Band, one of the clinically validated sleep watches that's out there. And they break it down into an effectiveness score from 0 to 100. And then based on that, they have reaction time, slowed by, and those types of things. From the surgeons that we analyzed, again, all of them felt that they were the 1%. Or the less than the 1%. And this is what we were really looking at. About 5% of the time, they had an elevated risk for accident or serious error. Reaction times, again, slowed down significantly. So even in these surgical populations, these high-performing individuals were seeing the same thing. This is an example of one particular individual, one particular surgeon. They wore them for about 2.5 months, and then we met with them again or discussed the data with them. And over the course of that 2.5 months, 100% of the time, they were below 90% effectiveness. 92.3% of the time, this particular individual, their sleep quality was below 7 out of 10. Right? In any academic setting, that's a failing grade for the most part. And so I show you this to say, an 11% elevated risk for accident or serious error is significant. And obviously in a setting like a surgical situation. right? So this is, again, something where we run into when you are sleep deprived, it's hard to know that you are sleep deprived because of some of the subjective measures that we talked about. So I wanted to show you that this high-performing scenario, these individuals that we're dealing with, crosses over not just sport. So in order to deal with that, what are some of the barriers? And again, some of the things that I wanted to discuss with my presentation was more, what are the things that we see in the trenches? So you've probably heard of the morning lark or the night owl. The morning larks makes up about 40% of the population, and night owls being about 30%. And that adult's chronotype is strongly determined by genetics. And the reality is in our scenario, we're fighting biology at times. And so our question really turns into more of a, how do we mitigate the detrimental effects for athletes as much as possible, knowing that we're not going to have the perfect scenario? And I mean possible from a scheduling sense. Can we restructure practices, which we've had some success of with some of our coaches, and from a biological sense? For the night owls who have morning training practice, frankly, they're at a disadvantage because their prefrontal cortex, in charge of high-level thought and logic, is essentially a cold engine in the middle of the winter that just takes some time to warm up. But we have this society that predominantly lives by the early bird gets the worm mentality, when these genetically hardwired night owls, suffer as a result. And so these are things that we fight coaches on all the time. You'll see here, this is a new study that just came out in BJSM, the contributing factors to sleep disturbance in athletes. What you'll see here is in the orange, you see the sport-specific factors that can cause some sleep disruption, and then also the non-sport specific factors. And the whole point, what I really like about this chart is it shows the holistic approach. It's not just that there are psychological benefits or strength benefits or illness and injury benefits. It's that it all has to come together. And interdisciplinary problems require interdisciplinary solutions. And so when we're going through this and I'm working with athletes, some of that might show up as there's more of an anxiety-related scenario where we need to communicate directly with sports psychology and work cohesively as a high-performance team to drive some of these changes. Commonly encountered situations that we deal with. Again, we have a lot of night matches. We have athletes taking ergogenic aids and caffeine to help them perform better at night, exacerbating the problems that we deal with. Tons of travel concerns and a lot of congested schedules. This year in particular, our basketball team got shut down for 3 weeks, and we ended up playing 14 games in 29 days in I think 7 different states. So these are issues that the average person's not dealing with, and again, we can't take the average mentality with the populations we're dealing with. Travel considerations in the collegiate setting, you've got some teams that fly charter, some teams that fly commercial. With that, you have varying options in food selections. If you're going through airports, your food selections are very limited as far as good quality food, stress of catching flights, so on and so forth. All different things that we have to consider. One team that I consulted with a few years ago, the LA Rams, they had a stretch where they went from LA to Jacksonville, Jacksonville to London, London to LA, LA to New York, and New York to LA. In consecutive weeks. It was a beast of a trip, and so we really focused on then how can we shift our body clocks to those environments and mitigate as many detriments and performance as possible. And so they traveled the most that year, and so it was something that they really felt like gave them a huge advantage. So how do we fix it? And I'm going to wrap up here because I certainly want to hear Dr. Watson talk. But this is something with good practice, good sleep hygiene, we really need to focus on with this particular scenario. These are some well-intentioned attempts. The caffeine, the physiological reason for this is the caffeine binds to the adenosine receptors that we talked about, blocking our sleep drive. So we try to limit caffeine in the afternoons as a result. Naps, we really promote those. We think that they're great. We call them nappuccinos, actually. If you can take a little bit of a coffee, fall asleep, wake up 30 minutes later, you don't have the grogginess, but you've gotten the benefits of the sleep. The problem with this is if you take too long of naps and you take the long naps later in the day in particular, that adenosine flushes out and that sleep drive when you want to go to bed is very minimal. And so when we deal with that, again, we kind of have this vicious cycle if we don't sleep and take naps properly. And the other side of this is, sleep is not like the bank. You can't just accumulate this massive debt and then hope to pay it all off on the weekend. So we really focus on educating our athletes here. I know I'm running out of time. I just wanted to give you a couple little examples. When our basketball team flew to Italy and competed over there, we walked through with them, shifting the body clock maybe an hour each day, using melatonin strategically to maybe help our bodies get into those shifts and really try to minimize the jet lag that we run into. And with that, we have different compression socks and things that we can do to mitigate edema building up. And then with this, again, it's a conversation with them of shifting the body clock, keeping movement, using some compression to help reduce some of the edema throughout the flight, and then really hammering home the performance nutrition. So hopefully you can see how this all totally comes together. And then this is a really good flow chart that just came out in the BJSM that I told you about, a flow diagram for practitioners to help optimize and manage the sleep for their athletes in their environment and under their control. This is another video, but the whole point of this, since it's not going to work, is we're well positioned to facilitate a better sleep culture for our athletes. And I hope this talk was useful to you and maybe even stimulate some thought on how you can implement better sleep practices within your environment, knowing some of the limitations that we run into in the professional and collegiate levels. So I know I had to run through that quick, and I'm sorry I took a couple minutes of time there over, Drew. So I will stop sharing and ask questions later, or answer questions later. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try and see if I can get mine up straight away here. Does that come up for you guys?
Yeah, it went away. It didn't. I could see your slides for a minute, but now I don't.
How about I just moved the window? So
there it is. Yeah, if you could switch that to full screen mode, that would be great. If you hit that, I think the maximize button. Yeah, perfect.
That work?
That's beautiful right there.
All right. So, Chris, thanks so much for all that. That was really fantastic. And I'll, be parroting, I think, a lot of the information that you had in there. I'll try and talk a little bit about how sleep relates to illness and injury specifically among athletes. But obviously, we share a passion for this, and I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to talk about this. I think it's just vitally important. It's also really nice to talk about something that isn't COVID for a little while. I don't have any real meaningful disclosures here. I'll talk about some research that was generated using funding from AMSSM as well as my home department. I'll talk about some data that gets collected using third-party commercially available software, but I have no relationship with them, and I won't even mention them by name. Not to be too kind of snarky right off the bat, but this really is what I'm trying to get across, is that I'll hopefully convince people that sleeping is good and you should do it more, but really specifically try and convey even more of the benefits of sleep in addition to the really important things that Chris mentioned. So these are the sleep recommendations that we're all familiar with from the National Sleep Foundation that, again, kind of lay out this expectation that most adolescents will require between 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Most adults, or young adults that we work with, will require about 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but also recognizing there's a lot of individual variation here. And what one person needs may be very different from the next. So individualizing our interpretation of someone's sleep, I think it can be a little more nuanced than just simply a line in the sand that we expect everyone to fall on one side of. But I agree completely with what Chris mentioned, where considering the academic demands, the social demands, the training load demands, I think it's really probably likely that most athletes need more sleep than what gets recommended for the general population. But at this point, at least, we don't have separate guidelines for athletes. As we're all probably aware, sleep deprivation in the US is really a pervasive problem. It affects a significant portion of the population and is associated with a number of negative health outcomes. Just looking at information from my state here in Wisconsin, this varies somewhat from county to county, but generally falls between a quarter to maybe 40% of individuals that fall short of their recommended amount of sleep. And this is associated with things like obesity, physical inactivity, smoking, And athletes really are no exception. There's study after study that documents that athletes just don't get sufficient sleep. They also report generally poor sleep quality, that this might be more associated to things like competition or more prevalent in some groups over others, but generally speaking, a significant proportion of athletes report poor sleep quality, and that although we recognize that physical activity in general is good for sleep, elite level athletes actually, in at least one study, report worse sleep quality than their non-athlete counterparts. And I think, just to echo some of what Chris said, this probably is a function of some unique barriers to sleep that athletes experience. Pre-competitive anxiety is a very big issue that affects a lot of athletes. It interferes with sleep close to the time when we want them to get it the most. Training and competition schedules early in the morning, late at night, obviously potentially interfere with time to sleep. Chris touched on this briefly, but there's more and more evidence that acute increases in training load actually can have a negative short-term effect on sleep duration and quality, which is a little counterintuitive to what we might conventionally think, but really needs to be kind of on our minds when we're imagining athletes that are in really heavy parts of their season. Travel, I won't belabor because Chris did a great job of sort of covering that, but again, it's an issue for athletes in particular. And athletes are just not great assessors of their own sleep need. I don't think they recognize how much they need. I don't think they recognize when their sleep is necessarily poor. And just again, to kind of echo this ongoing theme, I think that one of the real issues we have within Western society is that we seem to associate sacrifice of sleep as a good and necessary path to being successful. This is just a handful of kind of random quotes off of the internet that associate sacrificing sleep with financial success, performance increases. I think this is just a terrible message that we're continually having to fight with culturally, and it comes from the very highest levels of leadership. This is a quote that I won't read the whole thing, but effectively says, for people who say they need to sleep 8 hours, my message is to sleep faster. That was from a former governor of California. This is one that says, don't sleep any more than you have to. I usually sleep 4 hours a night. That's from a past president of the United States. So this messaging is really ubiquitous. We get it from all sides. And I think we have to be really forthright about actively undermining this cultural messaging that threatens athlete well-being and performance. So I'm going to touch briefly on sleep and illness. I think this is a pretty intuitive topic, and there's a lot of information from the general population. I'll just highlight a couple studies around athletes. This was a study from back in 2014 in adult cyclists that randomized them to either a control group or an overload group that they then monitored for 6 weeks. In the control group, they basically did 3 weeks of their habitual training load. In the overload group, they did 3 weeks of 30% above their habitual training load. And based on their response, the VO2 max testing during that time got grouped as either acute fatigue, or what we might think of as a physiologic response, or functional overreaching, meaning they're starting to look like they were pathologically adapting to the training load. And in that functionally overreached group, they found that they, by week 4, had a really significant decrease in their sleep duration relative to their own baseline and relative to the other groups. And interestingly enough, by that same 4th week, about half of them developed an upper respiratory infection. So small groups here, and difficult to kind of bold the causal lines between these things, but I do think it points at this relationship between increases in training load and kind of subsequent potential ramifications for sleep and even the development of illness. So a lot of the information I think out there about sleep and illness is from adults and older athletes. So we sought to try and identify what the relationships look like in a group of middle school athletes. And so we recruited over 200 of them and followed them for a full academic year, where at the baseline, we asked them to report some demographic information, physical activity levels, sports specialization, and then followed them every week through that 39 subsequent weeks to look at both physical activity and sleep, as well as whether they developed an illness at any point during that timeline. And what we found was that we put all these things together in our multivariable model, was that independent of the effects of age, sex, specialization, we found that higher levels of physical activity were associated with a decreased risk of illness the following week, which I think we would all find intuitive. But independent of that, we found that higher levels of sleep were associated with a decreased risk of illness the following week as well, to the extent that if an individual slept an hour more on average during any given week, they were 20% less likely to have an illness the following week. So consistent with what we've seen in other populations, but just kind of more information that we can use even for our younger athletes. And just sort of tilting over towards injury, I think this is a really important conversation that we've been having a lot more in the last few years, but this study I think really kind of got that started. This was a 2014 study that asked middle and high school athletes how much they had slept on average the prior year, and then looked back at training room logs to see which of those individuals had suffered an injury during the same time. And they looked at a whole bunch of different individual characteristics to see whether or not they were associated with injury. But when all these got lumped together, it basically boiled down to older individuals were more likely to have reported an injury, and those individuals who slept less than 8 hours during that period were 70% more likely to report having had an injury. So there's some limitations here. We're asking middle and high schoolers to accurately report how much they slept on average during the prior 12 months, and injuries and sleep were recorded during the same time, so it's hard to know whether one preceded the other. But I think this kind of pointed to this relationship that has really been a valuable discussion going forward since then. Recently, we tried to look at this prospectively as part of kind of a larger longitudinal study of girls volleyball athletes. We recruited about 2,000 athletes from nearly 80 high schools in our state that we followed through the course of a fall volleyball season. And at baseline, we asked them to report their typical sleep duration, their quality of life, their injury history, and then through the course of their season, their injuries were recorded by their athletic trainers. And what we found was that of those 260 plus injuries that they suffered, out of those variables that we evaluated in the beginning, those individuals who slept more were less likely to suffer an injury during the subsequent season, to the extent that an increased hour of average sleep during that period prior to the season starting was associated with a 15% decreased risk of an in-season injury. Now, full disclosure, we asked them baseline things at the end of the summer, so it could look a lot different during the school year, but nonetheless, I think continues to point toward this potential protective role of sleep in injury in athletes. But sleep doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we've spent a fair amount of time trying to look at different risk factors for injury that could potentially interact with it. So training load clearly interacts with sleep. Well-being in terms of things like mood, stress, fatigue, clearly interact with sleep, and they all potentially conspire to influence injury risk. So to try and tease out this relationship a little bit more, we followed a group of adolescent soccer athletes for a couple years, where we asked them every day to report their training load in terms of session rating of perceived exertion, to report their sleep duration in hours, and to report their sleep quality from this kind of -3 to +3 scale on the right. And if we look at their sleep through the course of that 2 years, I think it kind of reveals what we might expect. In general, their sleep is better over the summer. It's higher over winter break. It's higher over spring break. And during these academic periods, we see this kind of sawtooth pattern where they're really sleep deprived during the week, and then they try and catch up on the weekend. And I think this speaks to some of the issues perhaps around overscheduling that our adolescent athletes experience. But the majority of them were getting under 8 hours a night, and I think we see that consistently among different populations. So we wanted to try and look at how sleep and well-being interact with one another, and this is really just showing in each graph how increasing amounts of prior night's sleep relate to well-being the following morning. And it just presents this really clear dose-response relationship where the greater the duration of your sleep, the better you feel the following morning in terms of fatigue, stress, mood, soreness. The way this software is written, all of these variables, the higher the value, the better. That can seem a little counterintuitive with something like fatigue, but in either case, it just shows that the more you sleep, the better you feel the following morning. And I think that's intuitive, but what we also found was that training load increases had negative effects on well-being the following morning, but that a lot of this was actually mediated by sleep. In other words, if I have a really hard Tuesday, a big portion of the reason that I am more fatigued and more stressed and have a worse mood the following day is primarily because it interferes with my sleep that night. So if we can intervene at times of really high training loads, we may be able to undermine some of that negative effect and improve what are really additional risk factors for injury. So just to kind of build on that and try and see which of these are really the drivers of injury in collegiate athletes, we collected similar data from our collegiate basketball players over the course of 2 years, where we similarly asked them to enter the same kind of daily data in terms of training load, in terms of well-being, in terms of sleep, and then looked at the injuries that they had recorded by their athletic trainer through the course of their season for those 2 years. This is just showing day-to-day fluctuations in the total volume or total training load for the group and just how these kind of vary through the course of the season. On the left here is just the distribution of the injuries by week through year 1 and year 2. And on the right is showing kind of day-to-day averages in sleep duration and sleep quality. And I think there's 2 things that are interesting about this. One is that it doesn't really have that same pattern as adolescent athletes. And I think this is largely a reflection of the differences in schedule between high school athletes and college. High school athletes, I think, unfortunately, have very little control over their schedule and are often quite overscheduled at the detriment of their sleep duration, whereas collegiate athletes may have a little bit more control and not have quite as congested a schedule. But again, what we find is that our athletes are reporting that the overwhelming majority of them are getting less than what I would recommend of at least 8 hours of sleep. So on the left here, what we looked at is injuries per 1,000 hours following nights of varying amounts of sleep. And this really, I think, was quite dramatic when we first saw this. If you look at the injury risk after nights when people sleep less than 6 hours, it's 12 times higher than when they sleep more than 8 hours. So there's this kind of impression that your risk goes down and down the more you sleep. And when we put all of these things into kind of separate injury prediction models, we found that all of our well-being variables and both of our sleep variables were significant predictors of injury, in the sense that the better they were, the less likely someone was to suffer an injury later in that same day. But to try and get at whether well-being or sleep is really driving this, we put each well-being variable into a model with sleep to look at the independent effects. And I think what is interesting is that when we do that, basically the effects of mood, fatigue, and stress are no longer meaningful. And it's sleep duration that's really driving this injury risk. Again, pointing to this idea that sleep may be kind of the primary driver of a lot of these knock-on effects that conspire to increase the risk of things like illness and injury. But this is just one team, right? It's a relatively small group. It's one gender. So we wanted to see if this was reproducible, and did the exact same study in our collegiate volleyball athletes. This is now in press, but not quite out yet. But so for a full year, we did basically the exact same thing. This is showing the distribution of their time loss injuries through the course of that year. This is showing their same kind of average sleep duration and sleep quality. And again, highlighting that the majority of them fall under that 8-hour cutoff. And so we did the exact same modeling for this group as well. We looked at each of these variables separately, and they all, just like in basketball, were predictive of injury risk. When we put them together, it was a little interesting. We again saw a really kind of powerful prediction from sleep duration, but we saw that the well-being variables, although it was diminished, still did seem to have some influence. So a little bit different from our basketball group, in the sense that things like stress and mood and fatigue appear to have an additive risk in terms of injury prediction for our volleyball athletes. But in both groups, we saw really powerful effects of sleep, to the extent that a 1-hour increase in sleep was associated with a 30 to 40% decreased risk of injury the following day. I'll put that up against just about any intervention I have for reducing risk of injury in athletes. It's really that strong. And that this may be even more valuable during periods of kind of increased training load. All these models were sort of adjusted for that, but when we worry about well-being as an additional factor for injury risk, highlighting sleep and really prioritizing the interventions we have to improve sleep, I think, can be even more powerful. So hopefully that kind of brief run through does a little bit to convince you that sleep is valuable. So how then do we do it? And again, I'm kind of echoing some of the great information that that Chris presented. I think consistent sleep and wake times, they're not always under the control of our athletes, but to the extent that we can convince the coaching staff and athletes when they do have control over it are really valuable. Avoiding meals and fluids within 2 to 3 hours of sleep, I think, is really helpful. Sleep environments, I think, are maybe the most crucial piece that athletes aren't as aware of. I think human bodies and minds are tremendously adaptive then when they receive a consistent stimulus. And in this case, we just have to provide a stimulus that cues our body that it is time for us to go to sleep. So developing a routine for 30 minutes to 60 minutes prior to going to sleep that's calming and consistent really helps with sleep onset. I tried very hard to get electronic devices out of people's bedrooms. There was a lot of attention around blue light a few years ago, but really I think they're just stimulating. Social media, watching movies, whatever it is that's being done on electronic devices are just not things that necessarily cue your body that it's time to sleep. Clearly getting rid of stimulants is ideal, and if athletes are on ADHD medication, I consider this as a potential factor and try and modify that to the extent that I can. Clearly alcohol interferes with sleep. We think of it as a depressant, and it may in some cases help with sleep onset, but it really undermines sleep architecture and quality. And for that reason, I tried very hard to convey that it really should be eliminated. And I think a lot of the time that athletes present to us with poor sleep, what we ultimately find is that this is really a knock-on effect of underlying stress, and helping athletes to identify not only the stress that they have, but how that potentially affects their sleep is really valuable in improving their sleep overall, as well as their general well-being. If we have athletes that have evidence of overtraining, certainly the solution to that is reducing volume. And I think changes in sleep, particularly sleep quality, I think can be an early indicator of overtraining. And so being mindful that it may simply be a representation of something else going on is useful in trying to manage sleep for athletes. And then outside, so Chris did a great job of showing, I think, a time when something like melatonin is useful when you're shifting schedules for international travel. I do try and steer clear of medications for more sort of habitual sleep in order to prioritize sleep hygiene and not use a medication as a way to kind of shortcut the adaptive benefits of developing a proper sleep routine. Benzos, I think, are just habit forming and don't have any evidence of a performance benefit. And I would say that hypnotics really don't either. So generally speaking, I try very hard to look at more kind of habits around sleep than trying to solve them with a medication. So long story short, I hopefully have convinced you that sleep is associated with a decreased risk of illness and injury, and that the effect it has on injury risk is really dramatic. That well-being's influence on injury, which I and other people have really previously found, may be largely due to the effect of sleep. And I think that research in this area and even clinical interventions in this area may be better suited to prioritizing sleep to make sure that we improve well-being and injury rather than just focusing on well-being. Longitudinal reporting, I think, in athletes can be really useful. Like I mentioned, the amount of sleep that one individual needs may be very different from another. So when you're able to collect longitudinal data and monitor sleep in athletes, you can identify perturbations that you might not otherwise see and quickly move to try and help individuals. And then lastly, I think that opportunities for us to intervene to improve sleep have really wide-ranging benefits. Not only does it help well-being, illness, and injury, but like Chris talked about, it really does have a significant impact on performance, and it is perhaps no more useful at any time than during periods of high stress, whether that's academic, social, or competitive. So thanks again very much for the opportunity to talk about this. I'm looking forward to answering questions about it.
Thank you both, Chris and Drew. Those were awesome talks. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking I need to go take a nap, start changing some lifestyle habits, because I'm trying to burn the candle, I think, on both ends. Anyway, no, fantastic. And so I'm going to moderate some questions right now. I am opening up my chat feature. I don't see any questions right now coming in from the audience, but that's okay. I have lots. So what I'm going to do is try to think for the people who are going to be watching on AMSSM's YouTube later, and I'm going to try to ask what they might be wanting to know. Gosh, I just have like a multitude of things that I'd like to ask, and so I'll just start with this one. And Chris, and I'm sorry, Drew, this one I think would be for you, but Chris, if you want to give your thoughts too. How do you approach this with the individual athlete? Do you make this like a vital sign? Is this something you ask every patient, every athlete, how they're sleeping? How do you assess this? Do you use a questionnaire? Do you have people wearing smartwatches that assesses their sleep quality? I know like Fitbit's they claim to tell you about how well their people are sleeping, but you know, I find that I don't bring this up enough with patients. And is this something we should be asking everyone, or over to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I don't ask it of everybody. I certainly ask it in certain scenarios. So one that comes in a lot to the training room for us is fatigue. And I think there are a lot of preconceptions from athletes and even coaches about what the underlying issues around fatigue are. And so in cases of that, I really try and at least address potential underlying sleep issues. If athletes come in, you know, for stress issues, if they come in with mental health complaints, I really try and focus on sleep, not always necessarily thinking that sleep is the underlying ultimate cause, but just that the interactions with those, it's always a really valuable way to kind of address it. So there are certain conditions where I feel like I try and get after it just as a matter of, you know, making sure I don't miss it, I guess. In terms of how to do that, I mean, it's usually a conversation that's a little bit guided just sort of by a handful of kind of basic parameters around sleep. But we do more formal evaluations through some of the specialists that we collaborate with in our athletic department, and we have sleep specialists that I will refer people to if these initial kind of efforts towards sleep hygiene and sleep routines don't really seem to solve the issue. And I will point out, I didn't really have time for it in there. I mean, first things first, I do think there are some medical conditions we try and make sure are not underlying this, right? I mean, restless leg syndrome is really common. Obstructive sleep apnea is an issue, and particularly in certain populations of athletes, and mental health issues, like I mentioned. So making kind of sure to address those, and then otherwise just kind of a standardized conversation about it, initial intervention, and then really referral if needed.
Yeah. Are there specific questions that you ask someone when you're thinking sleep is an issue, or do you just ask them, how is your sleep? I'm guessing people are probably pretty poor at reporting how well they sleep, and probably overestimate how much they sleep to try to kind of please the doctor, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, Chris can certainly touch on this too. He actually included in his slides one of the more formal athlete sleep questionnaires that can be useful. To be honest, I haven't incorporated that systematically in my practice yet, but it's sort of on the horizon. For the time being, it's really trying to get a sense of what their sleep and wake times are. Are they consistent? Do they find they have difficulty with sleep onset? How frequently they wake up during the night? And then a lot of kind of downstream questions about things like caffeine and sources of stress and other potential factors that could influence it.
Got it.
Nate, if you don't mind, I'm going to hop in here real quick. The one thing that I'd just like to add is the culture of sleep and the overall feeling of what that's like within that team program or whatever it may be is really, really critical. Because you'll have some coaches that are saying kind of some of those quotes that Drew showed earlier, right? And it's fostering a bad environment. Now, on top of that, when we have some of these wearable technologies and those types of things, Drew brought up performance anxiety. I think a lot of times people think about that in the context of a game or a match, but that's very much in the context of practice as well. And so we've had multiple athletes that I've worked personally with where they've set an alarm for 1 a.m., 3 a.m., and 5 a.m. just because they're afraid that they're going to miss their training that morning at 6 or 7 a.m. Right. And obviously these are not very good sleep hygiene and overall good sleep practices. But those are the types of things that you deal with on a day-to-day basis with a lot of these individuals. So sleep culture and the environment that's created within that program from top down is really critical. So that the athletes don't feel like sleep is viewed as a punitive thing. I only slept 4 hours last night because I went out on Friday night. They don't want to be, you need them to be honest with their answers.
Yeah, and I might just offer one other kind of little piece to piggyback off that. I think that things like wearables can potentially have a really valuable role, especially in research settings. I get a little nervous about athletes using them in order to gauge how they're doing. I think you can actually create this sort of stress cycle where they don't know how they're supposed to feel or how well they slept until they look at the watch and then, oh, I didn't sleep well. And we're sort of caught in this reinforcing stressed loop where you get anxious about what your wearable tells you and that interferes with your sleep. And so I think trying to at least initially get a sense of getting them in touch with how they feel when they wake up and just longitudinally following what they feel like in terms of their fatigue and their mood and how well they think they slept rather than necessarily relying on a machine to tell them. I think they can have their role, but we do have to be wary of individuals who actually can end up with that being a source of stress, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I appreciate that. That answers my question. I I was wondering about, do you use watches and things to help people monitor sleep? But you nailed it. That really just kind of help people listen to their internal sensors, so to speak, is probably more important.
And I think some people will have perfectly good relationships with wearables and they're very, very useful. I think there are just others that may end up with sort of a stress-inducing relationship with it, and it ends up becoming sort of, the opposite of what you would hope it would do.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts on two things: the role of screen time and this effect of kids now having smartphones all the time. Well, kids, when I say that, I mean like adolescent, teen athletes all the way up through high school, college, and even elite level athletes. What is the effect of this mass flooding of our day with screens and media, as well as what has been the effect of the COVID pandemic on people's sleep habits? Maybe I'll just throw that one to Chris first. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's it's a great question. I actually agree very much with what Drew said earlier. I think a lot of it, blue light, everybody talks about, and we certainly know the effects of that. But so much of it is they're just getting mass stimuli all the time. And so we'll have athletes, a common thing is they'll play video games late into the night. And, I always talk to them. I said, you've got the pedal to the metal and then you turn off the game and you're expecting to just slam the brakes, right? That's not healthy for a car and that's not going to be healthy for you. And so you can't expect to have this perfect relationship with sleep when you're doing those types of things. And so, the phones are obviously something, but again, part of it to me is a little bit of, what fights are worth battling at the front end? Because if you go and tell athletes that they can't have their phone for an hour before they go to bed, generally you're going to lose that fight before it even starts. So kind of starting some of those just general sleep practices of bedtime routines and that type of thing. That's generally the approach we take.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add. I mean, specifically, I'm not familiar with research around sleep changes in adolescents during COVID. I mean, we've seen a lot of research around mental health issues, physical activity changes, quality of life changes, but sleep specifically, I'm not familiar with. I can only assume that given what we've seen in terms of mental health issues, that sleep has worsened alongside it, but I'm not familiar with any specific information around it, but I can only assume it goes hand in hand.
Yeah, that makes sense, Drew and Chris. I just theoretically thinking of all the people that are a lot more cramped indoors and spending a lot more time on virtual platforms for school, and that kind of lose that daylight exposure, maybe even this, not even really seeing the sun on some days, not getting as much exercise outdoors, not having as much sports as they've been used to playing. So it might just affect, how people are, operating throughout a 24-hour cycle. And I think that it's probably in the negative direction.
So interestingly, just one quick note on that. It's such a multifactorial situation. We actually saw a lot of teams come back, and in spite of being essentially detrained for months, they were actually performing better when they returned on certain performance jump tests and things like that than when they left. And so much of that is just, for the first time, these athletes took a break and they rested and they let their bodies recover. Of course, we see a decrement after that once the training loads increase, but we saw that with multiple teams here. So there's so many different factors to this and layers to kind of unravel.
Yeah. I know we're getting about to the hour mark, but thinking to our fellows who are going to be taking boards, I think one thing that might potentially come up is the factor of traveling and how, traveling to a different time zone and might impact an athlete's sleep schedule. And Chris, I liked how you showed that slide where you adjusted an athlete's night bedtime by about an hour a day before actually changing their clocks over to the local time. I thought that was really insightful. Do you have any more comments on that, and recommendations, like if you don't have the ability to get to that destination several days ahead of time to adjust? Do you actually tell people to go to bed at like 5 p.m. local time because that's 9 p.m. at home? Or how do you manage that?
Yeah, so a couple different ways. Generally, we'll try to shift an hour with our bedtime each night towards the local time. When we're traveling more than 3 time zones, so we go 3 time zones over, that's when we start to see the performance decrements. We don't typically in the research see it in 1 to 2 time zones. But with that, going east is also different than going west. And so dealing with some of those scenarios as well. But for the most part, and I completely agree with what Drew was talking about in regards to melatonin, it's not something that we suggest here, but in those unique scenarios, we will use it to try to stimulate the body to maybe turn on, hey, I'm getting sleepy, an hour in advance. And so we'll try to shift an hour a day, because when you go through the time zones, your body takes about 1 day per time zone to adjust. So if you're going 7 time zones, it's going to take 7 days before you're kind of back to normal on average. And so that's why we try to shift a little bit towards the front end so that we can kind of mitigate that risk on the back end.
That makes sense. So traveling east is different than traveling west. We'll just explore that thought for a minute. Say you live on the West Coast and you travel to the East Coast for a game. You're playing, say at 7 p.m. Eastern. Really, for your body, what is that, like 4 p.m.? But then anyway, how does that affect you? What's harder for athletes? Is it harder to live on the West Coast and play on the East Coast, or is it harder the other way, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so our internal body clocks are actually a little bit longer than 24 hours. They're about 24 hours and 15 minutes. And that doesn't seem like a lot, but we use natural light to help regulate us kind of into that 24-hour time zone. And it's easier to ask our bodies to extend the day and go longer than it is to ask our bodies to shorten the day. And so that's kind of some of the rationale as to why it's that way. Yeah.
That's awesome. So I think, I'm looking at the comments. Dr. Dink, he was on our subcommittee leadership. In an ideal world, we don't have a schedule to wake up to, but sometimes we have to wake up at a certain time. Is there any data on gentle wake up light alarms that replicate sunlight on the quality of sleep? Do either of you have any knowledge or experience with that?
I don't. That's not anything I'm familiar with in terms of data. I do I absolutely echo the sentiment that ideally you wouldn't have to have an alarm, and I think alarms can certainly be a stressful start to days a lot of the time. And for me, the best way to reduce that stress is to have a really consistent wake time so that you are close to wakefulness if and when you do require an alarm to go off. But I'm not familiar with any data around the benefits of different types of alarms in terms of facilitating waking. I don't know if Chris is, but that's not something I've run across.
I'm not aware of that either.
Sounds like an intriguing idea that one of us can look into. But well, excellent stuff. I'd love to keep picking your brains, but with respect for your time and others, I want to go ahead and wrap this session up. But thank you so much to both of you, Chris and Drew, for sharing this afternoon with us, just a little bit of your time and your expertise. And I think I'm going to go try to take a nap, get back on schedule. So, hey, yeah, thanks everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you, if not in person, but virtually at the AMSSM annual meeting. And yeah, you guys take care.